topic tonight is changes to domestic violence support services in New South Wales. Who gives the best support for women fleeing domestic violence and why? And the first speaker tonight is Gander. Kat currently runs the NGO consulting group NGOCG. The consultancy values the input and multiplicity of NGOs and believes in their diversity of voices and their leadership on critical social issues. This is important because the diversity is being narrowed at the moment. NGOCG works to support the sustainability of NGOs and collaborates with organisations that work to end gender inequity and increase women's participation and social inclusion. Kat has worked in the women's sector for over 25 years and held the position of Executive Officer for the New South Wales Women's Refuge movement between 2003 and 2012. She has a strong commitment to ending violence against women and has expert knowledge in this area. She has held Premier Advisory Council positions and state and national representative positions. During the recent New South Wales government reforms that resulted in the specialisation of women's domestic violence refuges being decimated, Kat worked with services to try and win tenders in a hostile, competitive environment and campaigned and continues to campaign on this issue. Kat will come and speak. Now, I'll introduce the second speaker when she's actually here. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak here this evening on what is a critical issue at the moment and will be in the future. Last year in June, the New South Wales Government released the Going Home, Staying Home policy that would determine the allocation of resources and services across the state for homes and services into the future. The reforms supposedly prioritised aims such as early intervention, a no wrong door approach, and it was commissioned by Deloitte and KPMG consultants. The impact that these reforms have had on the provision of specialist women's domestic violence services in New South Wales has been obliterating. Ironically, this year, 40 years on from when the first women and children's domestic violence refuge was established in Australia, Anne Summers, one of the founders of Australia's first feminist refuge, Elsie's, reflected on the forum that resulted in the establishment of Elsie's. In her book, Damned Whores and God's Police, she wrote this: early in March 1974, to mark International Women's Day, a huge two-day speak-out on violence was held in the Federation Auditorium in Sussex Street, Sydney. It was an emotionally wrenching experience to listen as woman after woman stood up and told of being raped, of being beaten, of being intimidated, and of living in fear. Many of these women were telling the stories for the first time, finally able to reveal what had been a shameful secret. By the end of the first day, there was not a woman present who was not weeping in empathy and seething with rage. We had to do something. Once women realised that their experiences were part of something larger than their own story, they became part of an exercise in mass conscious raising about the areas of women's lives which had been previously private, been silenced, and if raised, were ignored. Following this, a group of about 20 women established the first women's refuge in Australia by squatting in two adjacent houses. The plaque on the front wall of the house named it as Elsie's. The group spent the weekend making the houses habitable. Ludo McFerrin recounted that they painted, cleaned, repaired windows and doors, restored one kitchen and bathroom, and ran a hose from the house of a sympathetic neighbour to supply water. This was the unlikely beginning of one of the most significant social movements of the 20th century in Australia. Within 10 years, there were over 40 women's refuges in the state of New South Wales and more than 160 in Australia. And as significant was the elevation of domestic violence to a primary social issue. According to a 1975 survey on domestic assaults, the major reason that women remained in violent relationships for 89% of women was they simply had nowhere to go. a woman's safety was not a major consideration in the welfare, legal and medical institutions at the time. It was difficult for many women in this situation to find alternative accommodation. As long as the matrimonial house existed, women were not eligible for emergency housing. The Department of Housing would not house a single woman with children. Without a husband and a father, they were not considered to be a family. Many real estate agents and landlords would also not rent to single women, and they faced eviction if it was discovered that a man was no longer living with them. So we have come some way. The establishment of LCs was the beginning of something that would change the lives of thousands of women in Australia for decades to come. With the humble beginnings of mattresses on the floor of a derelict building and a hose passed over the fence by a friendly neighbour, the New South Wales Women's Refuge movement was about to begin. Prior to the recent reforms, the New South Wales Women's Refuge movement represented approximately 60 refuges across New South Wales. Its role in improving responses to women and children fleeing domestic violence has been pivotal. The movement played a key role in the establishment of the Domestic Violence Court Assistance Scheme, domestic violence laws, the funding for refuges, changes to relevant legislations in areas of family law, sexual assault, child sexual assault and housing. The movement was also crucial in raising awareness of the issues faced by children experiencing domestic violence and gaining the recognition for children as people in their own rights. The movement also recognised that Aboriginal women, lesbian women and women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds faced additional barriers. Therefore, specialist support groups and representative positions were established within its structure to address the access and equity issues of these groups. The organisation continually met for nearly 4 decades to improve its practices and approaches and to influence and advocate for continual structural policy and improvements. Women's refuges specialise in providing crisis accommodation, transitional housing support, help with legal protection, family law, child protection matters, advocacy for help, housing, mental health, counselling, financial issues. And they focus on the empowerment of women, which is very important for women who have been through a domestic violence relationship. They were well-connected services spread across New South Wales that had specialist understanding of the dynamics of domestic violence and the life-threatening tactics that perpetrators of violence can use in the early dangerous days after a woman leaves or is planning to leave. They walk beside women and children to move towards a better life, well aware of the pitfalls along the way and the challenges that women would face. The link between domestic violence with women and children's homelessness has been strong and persistent. It has remained the most prevalent reason for women and children accessing homelessness services and has been the primary cause of homelessness in Australia since the beginning of data collection in 1996. It's not single men with drug and alcohol problems or mental health problems. The leading cause of homelessness in Australia continues to be domestic violence. In the 9 years that I held the position of Executive Officer of the New South Wales Women's Refuge Movement and prior, there was much evidence that our structure and approach to supporting women and children needing to flee domestic and family violence was recognised internationally as leading in best practice. We were contacted by organisations all around the globe asking for information and support in their own establishment and improvement of services and systems. In 2012, we received one of 10 international awards given to countries for their work in supporting women and children escaping domestic violence. We did not apply for the award. The winners were identified through a global desktop review of evidence of achievements and practices. The New South Wales Women's Refuge Movement received the award for Australia. Ironically, the Minister states that the new reforms are based on evidence, not history, which seems to be code for removing funding from women's specialist services and putting it into generic services that just have women in the case mix. In November 2013, tenders for women's refuges and all homeless services across New South Wales were issued. Women's services were in shock when they saw the tender packages. Minister Upton stated that the reforms were a result of 2 years' extensive consultation with the sector. Services report no consultation. Some attended one meeting in their region and said that it was difficult to get women and children's issues on the agenda. The Minister states that the tenders and the reallocation of resources are based on need. This is also difficult to see when you look at the vast areas where there is no longer a women's domestic violence refuge. 6 out of the 15 districts have no specialist domestic violence refuge. For example, when you look beyond the Blue Mountains and head west, there is nothing. Towns like Burke, that have 10 times the state average of recorded domestic violence assault, lost their recent purpose-built women's safe house that they fought for 20-odd years to establish. It's been lost to a faith-based organisation that will provide a generic homeless service. This example is, I could go on and give you many examples, but I can confidently tell you that this example is replicated across the state. There is no evidence of the reforms being based on locations where high needs of domestic violence and therefore need exists, even though the Minister says we shifted these resources so that they were better able to meet needs. This is completely incorrect if you look at the statistics available. I mean, another example is Walgett, which actually has 40 times the state average. It has lost its service also to a faith-based organisation. And many of the faith-based organisations that have won the services have not had experience providing specialist domestic violence services previously. Prior to the reforms, there were 336 individual homeless services across the state. There were 149 tender packages. So those 336 homelessness services include services for families, single women, single men, and women and children escaping domestic violence, young people, young women, so there were youth refuges in that as well. So of that 336, there was only 149 tender packages. The tender packages were based on large districts and geared towards large organisations or consortiums. The majority of women-only services across New South Wales were not permitted to tender as women-only. Instead, tenders were based on a case mix model of providing services to men, women, families and young people. There was also a strong focus on employment and training, not usually the first support need for women and children fleeing domestic violence. And difficult to see where this fits into the Minister kind of talking about this being looking for innovative practice. In June, when the tenders were announced, it was devastating for most women's services. Of the 149 tenders, there were 69 successful providers. So we've gone from 336 providers to 69 successful providers out of this. Before the tender process, there were approximately 90 women's services in New South Wales. After the tenders, there are now 14 services run by women for women. There are a further 9 for women where there are new providers, 4 of them faith-based, and 3 women's services are partners, but not the lead agency. There is 1 for women with mental health issues and 1 that is yet to be decided. Many of the women's services lost through the process will now be generalist and managed by mainstream providers such as Mission Australia and Wesley Mission. It is heartbreaking for the sector and their communities to see such a loss of vital, trusted services. And it is impossible to see what improvements these reforms will bring to women and children needing the right support from the right service, the right staff, and at the right time. If we take, for example, being a women's and children's refuge that has operated for 30 years as a special women and children's service, its service was won in the tender process by a faith-based organisation that had been running a training and employment service in the area for 2 years with one staff member. It is now a generic service that just has women mentioned as a client in the case mix. I mean, one of the other issues around this is actually the buildings, because, you know, women often went in, and communities got together and they went in and they found buildings in their local communities. Often they were derelict and they needed a lot of work. And communities put that work in, and, you know, over time the services, you know, there was this increase in need for OH&S stuff. So a lot of services ended up being, that were community run, ended up being transferred to the Department of Housing because the organisations couldn't afford the maintenance bills, etc. So it's, a lot of these services now have been taken from those communities and given to all other organisations, when in the first place there was really a goodwill, you know, and an understanding that they would remain in those communities. So a lot of the houses as well that were there for women and children escaping domestic violence that were transitional, which meant that they could move from living in a crisis service into a transitional service where they needed ongoing support for, say, 12 months. Those houses are also gone into the mix for generic services. So it's not hard for me to say that it's difficult to find a redeeming feature about the going home, staying home reforms. And it's difficult to know the full impact until the services commence full operation on the 1st of November. So we're still actually in a transitional stage. But some of the trends that we're seeing already are really quite worrying. There's certainly been a reduction in staffing, and there's certainly not the specialist staff that there used to be. I know, for example, one service in a district where the faith-based organisation will not have staff there all the time, that they're proposing that women will make appointments with a caseworker if she has an issue, and then the caseworker will float across that district and come and visit her. I hardly see that this is an improvement in the type of services that women and children will receive. The other issue is that it's been very important that women's refuges have been provided 24/7. I mean, a lot of times domestic violence happens after hours, and women and children need access to a safe service. They need it when they need it, not the next day. Women often don't have, in domestic violence, don't have the money to go somewhere else. They're very reliant on that access to that service. A lot of services we know are talking about not providing that 24, the after hours, you know, support and weekend support. We know that police have been reporting difficulty in locating accommodation for women and children after hours. That's already occurring. There are less Aboriginal services in high needs areas. There are less culturally and linguistically diverse services. There will be a loss. The Women's Refuge Movement had a policy around each service had child specialist workers that worked with children and took into account that every child, even in a family of 5, has a different story and a different experience and needs a different response. There is no discussions from some of the large organisations that I have spoken with about them even having any understanding of what those really important needs are of children. And that if children get help early when they've experienced domestic violence, it can reduce a lot of the long-term suffering and issues that can occur if you don't get the right help at the right time. And, you know, the relationship between domestic violence and child protection is a very complex one. We have a system that overtly holds the mother to account over the perpetrator's violence, even though she is a victim herself. When women enter a refuge, they are often very nervous to talk about the extent of the violence, and they often minimalise it. It takes time to build trust and for this to change. This is often a strategy that women have used to survive, and can be a tactic that women continue to use when they leave the relationship. One of the drivers behind the strategy is not to draw attention to any child protection issues for fear of losing your children. For Aboriginal women, this fear can be 10 to 100-fold. I mean, I can't even speak about how big that fear can be. So this requires a very sensitive and skilled response. Walking beside women to navigate the child protection issues is extremely important in a complex environment and requires, a high level of skill and experience. How will the new service providers, many of them with little experience in providing services to women and children, respond in such a complex system of child protection and family law? Will they just tick the boxes or go out on a limb to advocate in a system that still does not welcome such challenges? These are the risks that have been taken in this reform that we are yet to see the outcomes of. The Minister keeps saying what we are doing to address homelessness before was not working. So, it's difficult because in some ways there may have been areas of these reforms not for women's domestic violence services that may have been needed, but to put everybody in the same boat and go out to a competitive tender, I think has been a giant mistake. And to say there is no evidence is absolutely not true. A study undertaken by Chris Sullivan on evaluating the effectiveness of women's refuges in 2011 found more than 4 in every 5 women, 85%, felt a lot safer and 81% felt more protected from the abuser. 95% felt either a lot or somewhat more confident about their decision making, and 95% reported having more information that would help them in the future. And there was also a really large meta-evaluation undertaken in looking at the effectiveness of women's refuges and the strategies used and whether they made women safer. And although they found that not one strategy is uniformly successful for all women, it is important to note that 2 strategies most likely to make a situation better were contacting a domestic violence victim service program, which 72% that showed outcomes of more likely to be safer, or actually staying in a domestic violence shelter was 79%. There was evidence of increased safety. This finding emphasises the invaluable nature of domestic violence services and shelters and reinforces the need to maintain funding and support for these programs so they can be accessible for all women who may need them. There are further studies on this. I won't go on about it, but I'm really trying to make the point that, the Minister's saying there isn't evidence around this, where there's actually very strong evidence. Yeah. The most dangerous time for women and children living in violence is when they decide to leave a perpetrator. And as I said, so with 1 in 2 women prior to the reforms being turned away every day from a refuge, instead of the government saying what we are doing is not working, they could have asked how many women's lives were saved because a trusted women's refuge was in their community. And what can we do about those that are being turned away? There's 1 in 2 figure, that 1 in 2 figure has been consistent for 15 years. Instead of saying we need more innovation, they could have found out what we actually do. I don't think they even knew what we did when they did this. There's little evidence to say that they understood it. I know now that I'm going to have to wrap up. So do I have 1 minute?
1 minute.
Yeah, okay. It's a tough time, Kimberly. The Minister and the Premier say they are proud of these reforms. This is really difficult to fathom when it comes at the destruction of 40 years of development of a connected and very effective specialist women's service sector. We know that the Minister's received thousands of letters on varying issues, and some of you may, and we've had very poor responses from that. There are issues around Aboriginal women's access to faith-based organisation, given the history of stolen generations. There's been 14,000 signatures on a petition from the SOS Women's Campaign that was collected and presented to the Premier. We've really had no adequate response on that. I think what's happening, it's happening ironically at a time when the federal government is also holding an inquiry into DV in Australia, and competitive tendering is here to stay. It's about to also happen in Queensland. So I think, you know, we've got a rolling issue here, and that if we don't learn at the moment from what's happened in New South Wales, then we're going to have a very sad-looking sector into the future. There are some petitions on the table here. We are continuing that the SOS campaign's doing. If you would like to take one and sign it and send it in, that would be great. They need to be hard signatures, and that's all. Thank you very much.